Hi, I'm Tom Kundig, and you're listening to U.S. Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. In an interview recorded in Brooklyn, New York, George Smart sat down with architect Joshua Ramus. The Huffington Post named him one of the 5 greatest architects under 50. Wallpaper Magazine described him as one of the world's most influential young architects. Esquire Magazine dubbed him the young savior of American architecture. Icon Magazine called him one of the 20 essential young architects. And Popular Mechanics said, Joshua who? Is he that cold fusion guy?
Graduating from Harvard in architecture in 1996, Ramus worked for Rem Koolhaas before forming his own practice, Rex, in 2006. Like many famous architects, Charles Gwathmey and Richard Meier come to mind, his mom helped him get the project that rocket-launched his career. He has been a visiting professor at Yale, Rice, Columbia, Harvard, MIT, and Syracuse. And in his spare time, he trained for the Olympics.
Really?
U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by modernist realtor Angela Roll.
In a timeless adventure that we are completely making up, realtor Angela Roll grew up in Estonia, the daughter of a former ambassador wrongly accused for spying on Lithuania, the little country next door. He was cleared, it turns out, because Estonia only has 6 spies, and everybody pretty much knows who they are.
Yeah.
After a night of partying with Le Corbusier's cousin, Boozy Corbusier, Angela took the ferry across the Gulf to Finland, causing an international incident involving a little red dress, a wood-turning lathe, stolen from the Finnish Coast Guard, and a $2,400 bar tab she accidentally signed over to Bjork.
Uh-oh.
Angela escaped the resulting media frenzy on a train to Denmark in the company of international man of mystery Eric of Aarhus, whom she later married and later moved to North Carolina to become a real estate agent. Specializing in modernist houses, Angela advises buyers and sellers on everything from appropriate renovation to shipping a wood-turning lathe from Helsinki. Reach her at angelaroll.com. That's ROEHL or 919-995-0550. And let's now join George and Joshua in the Rex conference room in Brooklyn.
What's the height of this room? These are... So that's 10 foot there. I think they're 14.
14.
13.
I love how you have height indicators on your wall for easy reference.
That's it. It comes up all the time. That came from we were trying to convince a client to reduce the heights of a house from 10 foot to 9 foot. It's just hard to build a house. We were doing this crazy 42,000 square foot house. On
the necklace house.
Necklace residence, yeah. And the client is adamant that it have 10 foot ceilings. And I just don't know that it's a big house, but the rooms aren't huge. There are some big rooms, but for the most part, it's going to sound silly to say, but the rooms are appropriately dimensioned for an otherwise crazy dimension house. So I think the 10-foot ceilings sometimes are going to be weird.
I assume there'll be some areas of the house where the ceilings are even taller, certain open areas.
They're actually not.
No, really? Okay.
Yeah. Also strange.
Okay.
But that was, he was really adamant. He wanted 10-foot ceilings everywhere. So that's how the project evolved.
Is that your first house that's going to actually be built?
Yes.
And where's it going up?
Lloyd Harbor.
Oh, that's a nice area.
Yeah. So East Egg. Yeah, we were speculating about where the Great Gatsby is.
Yeah. Where the motor cars are going back and forth.
Yeah. And Touchwood. I think everything, we're still going through the whole city. I think we've got approvals to go forward. It still has to be. Finally, we're waiting here to get the final pass from the city lawyers, but I think everything's...
Is it harder to get approvals out in that area versus here in the city, or easier?
I think that was a unique condition. It's a very large piece of property, of which we're proposing a very large structure, but it's a small structure when you place it in the size of the property. And, those things are quite personal. And it really has a lot to do with the specific design, because will the house be visible from the neighbors? Is it visible from the water? And those are all things are completely design dependent. So, and it wasn't contentious. It just took a while.
And this is for a multi-generational family?
3 generations.
3 generations. Yeah. How many people in that whole complex of rooms?
It is designed for the matriarch and patriarch. There are 4 kids.
I feel like I'm on Dallas now.
Yes. There are 4 children and their spouses. And then 2 children in 3 of the homes and 3 children in 1 of the children's homes.
So describe for our listeners how this house kind of looked, because it's not just a mass with a lot of rooms in it. It has a certain shape.
It was done through a competition, and some of
a house had a competition?
Yes.
I've never heard of that before.
It was done with a competition with 5 firms. And we would normally not agree to do a competition for a house until you see that it's a 40,000 square foot house and you see the property. And the client, he's a very sympathetic person. He's really compelling. Very smart, very warm, quiet. Nothing like you would expect. Talk about a Russian oligarch. I think there are a lot of images spring to mind, and he's none of them. There are no yachts. There are no carports with 40 cars. There's no...
and certainly no collusion. Let's just no collusion.
And there's no collusion.
Yes.
He's incredibly intelligent. He's very soft-spoken, very kind. He's very introverted.
So this sounds like the Russian modernist Waltons, kind of.
Yeah.
In Lloyd Harbor.
Yes.
A dinner bell will ring and everyone will come eat.
Well, and one of the original proposals was actually that we should have all of the dining rooms facing each other in the central courtyard, so that in theory there is a space in the house where the entire family could meet to have dinner. While in their respective residences, they could all have dinner together in virtue of seeing each other around the interior courtyard.
So if you're thinking, as Josh is talking about, these little houses that are sort of clustered around and they look across to each other, that's not what this thing is going to look like at all.
In the competition, he asked for several things that were unusual. Probably the most distinct one was that he wanted the residence for him, his 4 children and their future families. And the fact that we didn't know, those children were quite young, particularly at the time that we started. They couldn't form as clients. They couldn't perform as such. They didn't know their lifestyles. They don't know how many kids they'll have. They don't know what kind of home experience they would gravitate towards. The second is that, given his background, he didn't want a compound, which I think was probably an obvious reaction. If you're going to do effectively 5 residences in one, is that maybe you do something that's more compound-like. And he was really adamant he wanted a single structure. And then the last thing he asked for, which threw us in the competition, was he wanted a house that looked like it had always been there. And you can imagine that there were other competitors for whom that was a lot easier task than us. We don't know how to do that. we wouldn't know how to do that. We wouldn't do it well if we tried, and we wouldn't really want to do that. And so our reaction to that really was threefold. We abstracted the concepts of 5 really famous mid-century modern American homes.
Mm-hmm. Which ones? Do you remember?
So there's a Saarinen, the elder, Saarinen, the younger.
Yeah.
There's an Ungers. There's a Kahn. And then there's one ultimately. Their residence ultimately became one that we designed. It had a reference in that reference.
Okay.
Because as he was actually able to be a client, the others sort of started out as stand-ins of, we don't know how they will live, so let's abstract these known typologies that are distinct, so that as the kids grow, they would either... It's debatable as to whether or not the children will ever live with him.
Okay.
That's what he wants. That's not necessarily what the children want.
So by the time the children move into the house, how old will they be approximately?
One of them is in her mid-30s, but the others are anywhere between their teens to mid-20s.
Okay.
Now. We were working on the project for almost 6 years. So when we started, only one of them was even in college. The eldest was 30, 31, I think. So by providing very distinct living experiences, the thought was that the children would either gravitate towards one as they grew up. They might start to say, hey, that appeals to me more than the other. Or I think what will more likely happen is if they don't live with their parents, that they'll sort of timeshare. They'll barter for, I want to be in this house for Christmas, or that one for Easter, or that one for summer vacation. The thinking being is that instead of, originally he asked us, well, why don't you just do 4 identical houses for them? Like, it's not
too great.
Something compelling. We even talked about shelling them at first, like just making the enclosures, and they would come in later in life and sort of design their home within it. And we effectively would have to design a dummy house, and they would probably end up being the same dummy house. It effectively was the same result.
Isn't it kind of like getting a blow-up doll to go with you on the toll road?
Yes.
So you can get the HOV lane?
Yes.
Okay.
In the competition, that was our proposal was to give him this palette of distinct houses, aggregated together. The site is remarkable. It's about a 35, 40-foot slope down into Long Island Sound with an incredible panoramic view over the Sound. But actually, what's more impressive is the old-growth forest that looks inward. So when you go to the site, you, of course, naturally look out. And it's like looking at the ocean. It's nice. After 10 minutes, you start looking inwards. And when you look inwards, you realize it's actually way more beautiful. And it slopes quite steeply inland as well. And there was an existing structure, existing house, frankly a large house, but small in comparison to what we're doing, that sat on the bluff. And so the house, we took the 5 residences, we call them, and then there's 2 other pavilions. One is an entertainment pavilion, one's an event pavilion, and wrapped them into a ring. And it touches down where the previous structure was. So in terms of the footprint, we're actually not increasing the footprint. The rest is up on pilotis in the middle of the woods. So it creates this rather remarkable, almost like treehouse experience, where about 40% of the house is on grade with the view out, the kind of the ideal of being at the beach, and about 60% of the house is in the middle of the woods between 15 and 35 feet up in the air. In the middle of this old growth forest. It was incredibly beautiful. And
I think Tom Kundig did a house like this in North Carolina.
Oh, really?
In Cashers.
Yeah.
Very little known.
Yeah. He's an extraordinary architect. I think he is a highly unchampioned architect.
We've got him coming on the show in about 3 weeks.
You can tell him I think that.
Yeah, I will.
In response to it must look like it has always been there, the typologies that we referenced were all obviously modernist references, and as is probably our architectural bent, that was also the direction we were going in. So in the end, it's a bit of an architectural pun. I'm not sure most people will experience what I'm about to say, but they'll experience the bigger idea, which is to make it look like it has always been there instead of doing a Victorian or some other stylistically referential house to the 1800s. We did a house that looks like it has never been there. So we just wrapped it in mirror glass. From a detailing standpoint, it is almost literally the Farnsworth house that we then wrapped in mirror glass. So in fact, there are the slabs, and there are then W sections that are glommed to the exterior of the slab, and then the glass comes outboard of that. So literally, if you were to denude the building, it would look like the Farnsworth, the Farnsworth,
the structures and the beams and everything. Yeah,
Farnsworth house having propagated extensively.
That sounds like a scene out of Predator. Where that predator turns himself mirror and can't be seen and blends in with the background, and you've got a house like that with its own cloaking device, really.
And to our surprise, that was one of the things that the community cited for why they were okay with a project of that scale going forward. Is that, in fact, we went out and we made mock-ups on the site. They were like, yep, I really can't see it. So it stylistically unlike anything around them, and so you might expect there to be a NIMBYism.
Resistance, right?
Because it's different. Strangely, they appreciated the fact that although most people would react to, well, this is an unusual approach to the project, the neighbors were all appreciative of it.
Well, you've completely solved neighborhood opposition. You just make the house invisible.
Right. Well, I'm not sure it would work in many contexts. But,
I see.
But in that one, it seems to have done so.
So when is that going to be ready to move in with the Waltons?
I would guess 3 years.
3 years.
Yeah. That's a big structure.
Have you broken ground already?
We're doing site mobilization.
That means moving dirt, right?
That means moving dirt.
Okay. So 3 years, and we're going to have one heck of a house going up.
Touch wood.
Touch the woods here somewhere, right?
Yeah.
You kind of had me at house competition.
Yeah.
I've never heard of that before.
Yeah.
How did that get organized? Was it like through a magazine, or did the guy just write his 5 favorite architects and say, hey, I want to design a house?
He simply approached us. And for the longest time, we actually didn't know who the other competitors were. When we found out, it became obvious, given what he asked us to do, it became all the other competitors were people who you could imagine would be doing postmodern houses, large postmodern houses. And his daughter is very architecturally astute. She's the director of the Moscow Polytechnic Museum. And she's gone through pretty intense rebuilding of that institution. She worked with Fuchsis for a while. She's now working with a young Japanese architect. She's culturally and architecturally very astute. And so I think we may have been who she put on the list. Like, I think her father probably came up with most of the list, and then she really pushed to have us considered.
Do you get many letters from people saying, hey, Rex, I'd love you to design me a house?
Not yet, no. No. Maybe the size scares people away. Mm-hmm. I think there's a general belief that the house isn't real.
Okay.
In part because it's taken a very long time. I mean, it's a big project because it's a residential. Residential often takes a long time, but because of its scale and because of all the approvals process, it's been taking a very long time. So we actually, in the process of completing the construction documents about a year ago, we released a whole new set of renderings that were sort of the final design, and everyone's reaction generally was, oh, I didn't realize that was still alive. That could be part of it. Could be the size scares people away. Could be that we don't do a lot of residential. I don't know.
That's really exciting, though.
Yeah.
I can't wait to see it.
Yeah. We're doing a very modest house right now for one of my closest friends in Montana. Mm-hmm. It's a very, very simple, but I think hopefully elegant glass house on a bluff.
Oh, so that's 2 now. Okay.
Yeah. Though it's not mirrored.
Yeah.
But it actually is literally all glass. I mean, the Necklace residence has opaque portions behind the mirror glass, but this is the entire house is a glass house.
I assume you may have seen or heard of the movie The Lake House?
Yes.
With that glass house they built?
Yeah.
That was a great construction project.
I don't know, was it real?
It is real. It was real. It was an absolutely real house.
Yeah.
We're going to be having the architect who designed it on the show.
Yeah.
And the story is they, in order to film properly, to have that kind of beautiful backdrop over the water, they had to build it in a nature preserve. And in order to get the nature preserve people on board, they had to promise to destroy it after it was built. So this glorious glass house got constructed with the mailbox and the bridge and everything. And they filmed it and then gone.
Took it down.
Gone. Oh, so sad.
I'm guessing the plumbing didn't work.
I don't know if they hooked up the plumbing or not. I know they had electrical in it, and they had some of the permits pulled. Where did you grow up?
So I was born in Connecticut.
Connecticut.
My father was a professor at Yale, and when my parents separated, my mother went to Northern Virginia and then subsequently to Seattle, to Bainbridge Island. So I went to high school in Bainbridge Island. But my father, probably 1976, I'm guessing, went to Duke.
Okay.
And he's a marine botanist, so he's been in Beaufort since then.
Sure, yeah.
So I've spent every summer growing up and just about every one since on the Outer Banks. On the inland side of the Outer Banks, in Beaufort and Atlantic Beach. And
I think there are 2 modernist houses in that town.
I just know of one. In fact, you referenced it.
I told you about one of them.
It is very beautiful. It's quite controversial, as you can imagine, in historic Beaufort. Fortunately for the owners, it's just outside of the official historic district. I don't know that it would even have been allowed to be built if it had been inside that. I just don't know.
There would have been riots, I'm sure.
There's been many moments where people have said to me, "Oh, hey, you're an architect. What do you think of that house over there?" And I always have to kind of really hold my tongue.
That's funny.
Not because I would have any critique of the house, but I would have a critique of the person who's trying to get me to critique the house. There may be others, but that's the only one I know of. At least the only one I know of the controversy around it.
So when did you start spending summers down in Beaufort?
It would have been starting in 76.
76?
Yeah.
So you were...
I'm pretty sure I was 7 when my dad moved there. And he moved originally out to a place called Gloucester, which is a tiny town.
Tiny town.
Down east. It was about a 35, 40-minute drive from the tiny town of Beaufort, but pretty idyllic as a small child, to be out there and go wading into the estuary and crab. And we had in fact, something my father did the whole time we were growing up is we always had a small boat, small juniper. It's a classic Carolina boat from that area. A small juniper skiff with a tiny 2-horsepower British Seagull engine. And his deal with us was that he would support the boat. When you're 7, 8, 9, you didn't have any money, so
any budget for boating.
Any budget. So he would support the boat on the condition we had to bring something home for dinner every night. So my brother and my life at that age was always, okay, so we want to go swimming on Shackleford, so we've got to set a gill net by 9. We've got to be back to get it by noon. So what's our itinerary from all that? Or we set crab pots, or we go stomping for clams, or
sure.
There was a fair amount of illegal scalloping,
of course,
at that age. But yeah, so we'd come home every night
and have a great meal.
Fabulous
meal.
Yeah.
Was architecture a part of your headspace at that point? At age 7?
Sort of, in that my maternal grandfather was a civil engineer, did large bridges, and I was very math-oriented as a kid, and so from a really young age, he was teaching me trig and algebra, and I think always with the intent of trying to convince me to go into either engineering or architecture. I think at a young age I would have said that. As I got older, I was a musician, and I went originally to undergrad thinking I was going to be a musician.
You became a philosopher.
I studied philosophy.
Yeah.
Which I also got a bit disillusioned with. It seems like, in my opinion, if you study philosophy, you either absolutely love it, or you start to realize that it's a bit like, history goes to the victor. Mm-hmm. Every great philosopher tends to debate the last dead guy. And of course they can win because the last one's dead. And so you get really enamored with the person you're studying, only to have the next person you start to study eviscerate them. And at first you think that's exciting because you think, oh, this is really amazing what this next person
like
doing.
You're improving the model.
You're improving. At some point you realize it's merely a fact that if you've got 3 or 4 philosophers alive at the same time, they take each other apart and none of them become famous. It's the one who happens to be alive when no one else is around that can succeed because they're debating dead people.
Wow.
And if you come to that conclusion, which a lot of people do, you get a bit disillusioned.
Do we have any philosophers left in America alive currently? I mean, I heard Ken Wilber's name batted around occasionally, but...
I wrote my thesis on a Harvard philosopher named Derek Parfit, particularly from the generation that grew up with Star Trek. It is actually a very practical philosophy, and that's part of what I got disillusioned about.
I thought you were a Luke Skywalker man.
Also, but
okay,
I'd say that's all. I definitely would side towards Star Wars over Star Trek.
Okay,
but what bothered me about studying philosophy is I didn't see that there was much practical application, right? And that was the whole point, and then it remains very esoteric and divorced from
real life.
Yeah. And that bothered me. And that's actually why I eventually went into architecture. And what Derek Parfit, he talks about personal identity. How do we know who we are ourselves? And one of the classic discussions in philosophy about personal identity is what defines our identity? Is it our continuity of thought, or is it a continuity of body? And of course, there's all kinds of thought experiments you can play about that. There are a lot of people who innately gravitate towards, well, of course, it's my body. I'm going to grow and I'm going to change in my consciousness, so it's my body. But then the moment you understand that science can show that every cell in your body changes over in whatever 3 years or whatever it is,
right,
that something goes out that window. But he then starts to play these thought experiments, and the most compelling ones all have to do with Star Trek.
Really?
And he talks about, okay, so I'm on Earth. Okay. And I'm going to get into a teletransporter, and you're going to get beamed to the moon.
Okay.
So it takes me apart and it shoots all of my atoms, molecules to the moon and recreates me. Am I the same? And a lot of people say yes. He says, okay, well, what if it takes you apart down here, but it recreates you up there with a whole new set of atoms? Are you still the same person? And that's so all of a sudden people start to get uncomfortable. So
right.
They say, yes. Is it the same consciousness? Does that person know everything that I know?
Because in that second one, you're kind of Xeroxing yourself in a way, right?
But some people will, and I tend to agree with them. They will say, well, does that person know everything I know? And the argument at the moment, because we can't actually do that, is, okay, let's, for the thought experiment purposes, say yes. So some people will say, okay, continuity of consciousness, yes, I'm the same person that's out there. And the thought experiments get very, very sophisticated, but they start out in this very kind of rudimentary way. But he just constantly toggles you back and forth between, nope, it's my mind. No, it's my body. No, it's my mind. No, it's my... And so he then asks the people who think it's consciousness, he says, okay, so what happens if, as they're taking you apart down here, the machine breaks? And it doesn't really take you apart, and you're now going to be alive for 10 minutes, but it's already formed you up on the moon. You have no problem with that, right? Because the one on the moon has your continuity of consciousness. And all of a sudden, the people who said it's the continuity of consciousness start getting uncomfortable because they're like, wait, I'm alive? You're like, yeah, but... And so he just kind of goes back and forth and back and forth. And it's an incredibly pragmatic series of sort of tests that he puts people through. And maybe because of the cultural reference of Star Trek. And it's not the only reference he makes, but I always found it very compelling.
Well, somewhere along the line, either you or the one we beamed to the moon decided that your identity was going to be an architect.
Yes.
When did that happen?
I had an extraordinary sculpture professor at Yale, Erwin Hauer, who many people know because he recently passed away. He did these extraordinary... He did very sensuous, abstract sculpture, but what he became quite known for and quite wealthy for having developed were the screen walls that all the high modernists used. These very intricate bricks or tiles that you would stack, and they would three-dimensionally weave through each other. And if you see, they almost look like Escher. Where one side, when you see the brick or the tile, it's quite beautiful as a singular object. When you start to aggregate them, they make things that weave in really extraordinary ways. And they were all done in a way that you could cast them. And
so how do you make money on that? Do you license it to somebody?
If you look, they're all over Saarinen's houses and buildings. Everyone used them. Niemeyer used them. Everyone used them. To my knowledge, he actually had his own fabrication plant in New Haven. He was actually making them.
Yeah, I think you're right about that.
And at some point, there was an architecture student from Yale who went into business with him. I took this amazing course with him, a sculpture course, in which all we did for the entire semester was to attempt to replicate a huge whalebone. The whalebone was quite reminiscent of his work. And it was this very beautiful abstract thing.
Was it a large?
Large, yeah. Big? Yeah, maybe 3 feet long, maybe a foot tall. And I don't know what, maybe it was a part of a flipper, but it had the kind of knuckle, like a socket, but it wasn't just a single socket. It almost had like 2 balls on it. Mm-hmm. Incredibly beautiful object. And part of it was incredibly shiny. Part of it had the kind of the pitting of of a central part of the bone. And he was ruthless about, you had to make an exact replica. And that's all we did the entire semester. So 3 hours twice a week for 16 weeks, 13, I can't remember how long the semesters were. That was all you did. And it was kind of extraordinary. And it was also amazing is who could do it and who couldn't. Some people just couldn't do it. Some people could. And then he started to ask, though that was what you had to do this semester, he started to encourage you to start to do side projects. And he really encouraged me to go into either sculpture or architecture. And so at his...
I assume you accomplished this task. You made your bone.
Yes, I made my bone, which, since it seems sort of like just an activity of replication, doesn't seem like it should be that.
No, it would be incredibly difficult.
What was surprising was that basically only a few of us, through the, however many hours, actually were able to come close to achieving it. He did it as a way of teaching discipline and refinement, and for the students for whom he thought could expand beyond that, it was almost like can I say gateway drug on this?
Sure.
It's almost like a gateway drug. Like, I think, I've never really thought about this, but in retrospect, I think what he was doing is, it was an extraordinary task for anyone. It taught people about how to look and how to understand proportion and to question perception and proportion. I think it was an extraordinary and worthwhile experience for everyone.
Well, I imagine that you had to learn persistence in there as well.
Yeah.
You had to really persist in this kind of project for a semester.
And if you did things that he didn't, he would literally just destroy it. You'd have to start over. I mean, there were certain kind of Machiavellian
things.
Just
whack out your bone?
Wow. Very Machiavellian. By getting them, to encourage them then to, why don't you do this thing on the side? It was actually like a way of spawning their creativity, because they didn't think they were doing assignments. I didn't think I was doing an assignment. I was just sort of into this, and now my teacher's showing interest and he's saying, hey, why don't you try these other things? And so it was sort of like, focus over here, and you don't realize that he's actually teaching you over here. Because there were several of us that, during the course of the semester, ended up doing pretty interesting work that wasn't actually, quote, the purpose of the studio. And it was from that he then said, you should really consider doing this. And so my senior year, I had to go through all the process of intensive thesis requirement for seniors. But other than that, basically all I did is took studio art and architecture courses.
You were sold. Now, was this before you started rowing, or was that going on at the same time?
Going on at the same time. I started rowing freshman year. Unfortunately, probably why I stopped pursuing music, because I couldn't do both.
Yeah.
And I really fell in love with rowing. To be honest, I think at some point it had become my identity. I was a French horn player. And I'm not sure I really loved it anymore, but it had become so much my identity that I kind of kept doing it.
Yeah.
And rowing was kind of the excuse to stop doing it.
To let go.
To let go. And to have a different passion that was very intense. It took a lot of commitment. And so it was a release from one passion to another.
And you took that pretty far.
Yeah. So I trained all the way through the 1996 Olympic trials. And I was in the single and was knocked out in the semifinals.
This is while you're going to graduate school, right?
Yes. So I was,
usually graduate students don't tend to carve a lot of free time for even food, but you managed to pull nearly a Olympic qualifying out of it.
But it actually was incredibly productive, because I think a lot of students, particularly in architecture school, will spend a lot of time milling around in studio and being social. And I think that's probably a bit of a problem with architects in general, is that there's not a kind of precision to the creative process. Mm-hmm. But I was training twice a day, so I had to be on the water at 5 in the morning and 5 at night. And that required a lot of precision in
your schedule.
In my schedule. And so I would be, having been awake for 3.5 hours at my desk at 8:30 in the morning, my classmates wouldn't show up for 3 more hours. So I would have 3 hours of completely undistracted time at my desk to work. Then we would do our coursework and studio work, and then I would go back on the water. I would go back to school for an hour or two, again, very focused, and then I'd go to bed because I had to be up at 4:45.
Yeah.
And I didn't really have any social life, but the rigor of it, and I did that 7 days a week. I had Sundays off, so I worked all day on Sundays. But because I had this dual life that was really demanding, I think I was very successful in graduate school, so it certainly didn't diminish my performance in school. And I think a lot of that has to do with just the forced discipline of it.
So between the discipline of rowing, recreating whalebone, in running your office here, are there certain gauntlets that young architects have to go through in order to learn those skills from you, or do they come here with them already?
I think certainly by now people self-select. The people who come to us tend to think the way that we do, tend to be quite argument-based in the way they approach architecture. I think if someone is very formal in their aspirations, formal meaning form-based, not regimented. There's a whole host of firms out there who
need that.
They would be naturally more interested in. We're much more interested in idea-based architectural generation, and so
which really means you're trying to solve a problem, right?
Trying to solve a problem. The caveat I always say is that does not mean that we subscribe to form follows function.
Right.
I say this so many times, I will now say it in a way that sounds canned, because it kind of is at this point, but we think that schism is really unproductive. Like, form versus function, why? Why even have that
discussion?
And I frankly, I think it's a fault in large part to American postmodernism.
Okay.
I think because the economy was so bad in the 70s that the rise of postmodernism, there wasn't a lot of work, and so it became interesting to discuss the autonomous language of architecture. But in the process, they had to kind of denigrate functionality in order to argue why that was important. So they created this schism that we've been suffering through ever since. We just don't see the point in it, really. And so beauty is really, really important to us. We talk about it all the time in the studio. But what we're trying to do is to advance how buildings can, in a really banal way, do things. How can it solve certain kinds of problems? How can it solve issues of flexibility? How can it solve operational versus capital budgets and address those disparities? How can it deal with certain social or political problems? Certainly, there are a lot of designs that we have done for developers which have very ambitious designs where the argument is entirely rooted in them being development strategies. And what's interesting about that is that we can work with clients to do so I guess the point I'm trying to make is that doesn't come at the expense of form and beauty and aesthetics. And in fact, because you're so focused on talking about tailored performance, if you're really true to that, if you really somehow suspend convention, you will arrive at architectural proposals that are really unusual, things that no one has seen before. It's for others to decide if they're radically beautiful or not. They're certainly radical. I don't think anyone will look at our work and go, "Oh, it's not ambitious,"
right,
formally. So often I think that strangely by focusing on the building's performance, we can go much further in conventional terms than other people because it gets piggybacked on something. I often say beauty is important to us. We're just not dumb enough to talk about it in public. We don't ever try to convince a client to do something based on beauty. We try to very clearly identify the issues we have to solve and the positions we collectively want to take, and then we try to solve those in really novel ways. I shouldn't say novel. We don't care if it's novel. We just want to solve it in the most efficient way. Sometimes it's novel. Sometimes we reaffirm things that people may have discarded. Sometimes we go back to old typologies, and sometimes it becomes really clear. You know what? The convention is the best thing you can do. Let's just stick with it. But that kind of critical naivete, that's how we describe it, where we go back to root issues and doggedly explore them without any kind of preconceived idea of what the solution will be. very often will arrive at results that are really unique.
Are there certain problems that you want to solve that a client has not presented you a building with which to do that yet?
There are some that are some problems and some typologies. We have had the misfortune or fortune, I don't know, of coming in second on a number of pretty significant museum competitions.
Okay.
In which we have been advancing an idea about museum flexibility and curation that I wish we would win or get a commission to do it, because I think it, obviously we're pursuing this. Of course, I think it's interesting, but I actually genuinely think that it's really, it has something to offer, and it's rooted in and we do spend a lot of time in the studio talking about the failure of the kind of 20th century idea of flexibility. If you make a space, it's kind of a blank slate that you can do anything in, and I think historically those spaces just haven't worked because they require a lot of operational budget to do it.
Yeah, some of them are awful. And just awful.
Kind of devoid of character, and they take a lot of money, and they're daunting because, if you're a museum curator, you get a blank space and you have to create the entire thing every time. And so even spaces like the Guggenheim, which has a lot of architectural character, poses a similar problem in that it's relatively big. And so every single time, it's impossible within that system for a curator to do a small show. What are you going to do? Use a third of the ramp?
Right.
So they get put into a similar problem of feeding this beast that they have to constantly curate and imagine something for. Though it was originally looking at the Guggenheim that we came up with the idea, which was that if you can, a lot of artists, painters, printmakers find working within a blank canvas daunting. And so people like Picasso would take his zinc plate and would scratch it on a floor or something, so that when he started to work, he was already working into something that existed. Mm-hmm. And that's basically the underlying idea, is that if we could give a curator a palette of very distinct experiences, all of which we show how they can transform to some degree, we built that in. Is that then something with which or against which they can work? And in the process, you have a much greater spectrum of real flexibility. Does that make sense?
Sure. Well, when I was looking at your projects, the thing I kept wishing that you would be designing was a hospital. Mm-hmm. I would like to see a Rex hospital.
We would love to do a hospital and or an airport, just because of the systems involved.
Yeah. And I could see you being really creative.
With lots of convention that they might be right. I don't know about hospitals. I know that airports, there's a lot of convention that actually is not right. And we would love to upend that. I mean, that reinventing or challenging typologies, we like doing that. I'm much more excited if we come up with if we think we've come up with a new model for how to do a museum than to do a really pretty one.
Right.
Hopefully we'll also do a pretty one.
Sure.
But we're much more interested in being able to say, okay, that's a new model. And sometimes I think we've achieved it. Some projects have certainly challenged existing typologies enough that whether or not people pursued what we've done, they certainly started asking questions after it. And, when I said I got disillusioned with philosophy and went into architecture, that was what I had hoped to do as an architect, was to pursue the ideas that we might discuss when I was an undergrad, but didn't see anyone actually trying to implement them in any way. Could we implement ideas that were really ambitious?
Well, I sure hope you get a hospital, because I think I would love to be sick in one of your hospitals.
You would not love to be sick, but if you were, you would love to be sick.
Right, in that place, in that particular place.
Yeah.
Last question for you. I just noticed in compiling all the information on our website that a lot of great architects got some big break early in their careers from their moms. I understand that happened to you as well.
Yes.
Tell us that story.
So my first, kind of the only job I ever had was with OMA in the Netherlands. I went there directly after failing to make the Olympic team. Literally drove home, put my boat in storage, and flew to the Netherlands. And 4 years after being in the Netherlands, I was working for a very famous Dutch architect named Rem Koolhaas, who I eventually became a partner with. And he was traveling somewhere. I don't know, he was in Korea, I think. And I got a call from my mother saying...
Who's living in Seattle.
Who had been in Seattle since 1983. Called and said, I'm reading the newspaper in the Seattle Times, and did you know that there is a meeting for a new central library downtown? This must have been like a Wednesday night, Rotterdam time. And she said, it's on Friday afternoon in Seattle, and it's mandatory. If you don't show up, you don't get to go to the post. So there's this sort of informational meeting, but that was something that was very interesting about that project is the client set all these like tripwires to see if people were really committed. So one of them was, if you don't show up for the informational meeting, you're clearly not interested, so don't apply.
Yeah.
So I went to bed, got up in the morning, took a flight home, got there that night, slept in my own bed, and went to the informational meeting. And I didn't tell Rem because I couldn't reach him. That this was in the
mid-90s, I would guess. Yeah,
late 90s. I guess
cell phones were invented, but
but it was we were still communicating by fax. We didn't know where he was, and so it was sort of afterwards as a mea culpa. I reached him and said, hey, we're going after a library in Seattle. I hope that's okay.
So you went to the meeting, and you ultimately got the project.
Yeah, through attrition. I mean, that was years later. The city librarian admitted that we were like this group that just couldn't get rid of.
Mm-hmm. Just kept coming back.
We just kept coming back, and we sort of outlasted them.
And the Seattle Library is really one of the treasured buildings in Seattle.
It was the right project at the right time. Seattle has an incredible... It's where the Wobblies started, sort of where American labor unions effectively started. So there's a very strong social thrust in the city, still is. Obviously, it's the home of Microsoft and Amazon and Real Networks and
all those big companies.
All those big companies, and they were very interested in libraries at that moment. A lot of people spending a lot of money trying to...
Yeah, because we're going to put CD-ROMs in them.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, we're going to make those.
But also the e-ink, right?
Yeah.
There's all these ideas about how they would make the book go away. There's also a lot of money because of that in the city, and there's an amazing confluence of a remarkable city librarian and a remarkable board, and those things all came together to do a kind of once in a lifetime project.
How did you escape all of this and growing up in Seattle, and you don't like coffee?
I'm obnoxious enough as it is without caffeine.
Okay. All right.
It's self-preservation.
Well, this has been fun, Josh. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Angela Roll, your special real estate agent for Modernist Houses. 919-995-0550. Okay, take us out, Tom.
Visit usmodernist.org's massive archives to listen to past shows, discover 7,000 classic mid-century modernist houses by all the architects you love, and access 2.5 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song was performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl. Guest research is by Cindy Stratton, not her real name, an enigma to some, feared by others. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guild. George and I'll be back very soon with another edition of U.S. Modernist Radio.